So let's do a few minutes on World War II and then try to get to the history of the peace movements because I think it is critically important. I think World War II is the top topic of U.S. books and news and entertainment and movies. It is the foundational myth of U.S. culture. It's the origins of the U.S. polity as it's understood today. It is, World War II is the fundamental basis for the belief that war can be a good thing. And I think there's a problem with that because there isn't any other area in our culture, in our academics, in our understanding where we go back 75 years to find the most recent example that will hold up as a good example to justify it. And this happens to be our #1 project as a society. The thing that the United States dumps 60% of federal discretionary spending, $1 trillion a year. This is the biggest thing we do as a people, is prepare for wars, which, as Eisenhower and thousands of other reasonably intelligent people have pointed out, generates more wars rather than preventing wars. And so if your #1 project is you're going to rely on something from 75 years ago to justify dumping our grandchildren's unearned pay into, preparing for more wars next year, there ought to have not been any significant relevant changes in those 75 years to make that example still relevant. And I happen to think that the fact that nonviolence as a tool of social change was barely grasped by anyone in the 1940s, that nuclear weapons didn't exist, that war was legal, that conquest of territory was accepted, that colonization was the norm, that international law and the United Nations did not exist in the way that they do now, that the politics of any nation on earth hardly resembled those of today, that the weaponry of war bore almost no similarities to the weaponry of war today, and so forth, are all actually pretty darn relevant changes. And so you have to explain to me why World War II is still relevant. Because if I'm going to justify taking $1 trillion or even $1 next year and putting it into preparing for more wars, I want to know that there could be a good one in the future, not just that you think there was a good one 75 years ago, which, if that's all you think, that there was a good one 75 years ago, necessary, just, justified, or whatever word you want to use, but you don't think there could ever possibly be a good one tomorrow, then hey, who cares, But the problem is that most people in the United States believe that the militarism of today is justified by Adolf Hitler. And so, that's one way to dismiss the World War II argument, which is not good enough for anybody. So you have to actually talk about World War II and the myths that have been built up around it. I'm very pleased to see that there are not plastic bottles of water being offered to me at this event, as at most events. What does the word Evian mean to any of you beyond plastic bottles of water and naive backwards?
It's another.
Wasn't there some conference in the city of Evian for I think back in those days, but I don't know what it was about.
Very, very, almost unique. Not as unique as All Wars Are Always Justified, but almost you're actually the second person at any event that I've been at. And it may not be fair because you've been at events where I spoke before.
I'm also a history buff, so.
So the fact is that during the lead up to World War II and right through the course of World War II, as everyone became well aware of what the Nazi policy to the Jews was and was becoming, the governments of the world held conferences to discuss which countries would accept the Jews, because the Nazis' insane, barbaric, unacceptable, not justifiable, ludicrous policy was not to kill all the Jews, it was to expel them. Hitler wanted to put them all on luxury cruise ships and send them anywhere in the world that would accept them. And the biggest, most famous conference with the most nations of the world was held in the town of Evian, France. And the decision, almost unanimously, as at every subsequent conference, was not to accept any Jews. There were two slight exceptions in the Dominican Republic and one other small country that ended up not accepting hardly any Jews. But the reason for not accepting the Jews was straightforward, open, shameless racism. We don't want that race in our country. This was the position of the majority of Americans in public opinion polls. This was the majority opinion of people around the world and governments around the world. The representative at Evian of Australia said, I'm guessing without having consulted the native people of Australia, Australia doesn't have any race problem. Why would we want to import one? Right? This was, and the Dominican Republic, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, the reason he wanted to import Jews was because he thought they were superior to the largely African ancestry of the people of the Dominican Republic. Right? So racism can go any which weird direction. But this was so, through the years leading up to World War II, right through the course of World War II, the attitude toward the Jewish people of Germany and the lands that subsequently were being conquered by Germany was we could not possibly care less. And the peace activists who went to the US State Department and went to the British government and went to the Secretary of State and went to Winston Churchill and went to his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and said, can you not bring out the Jews? Even right after the grand removal of all those thousands of British troops from Dunkirk. Why can't you got all these ships and all these planes, and Hitler keeps saying you're a bunch of hypocrites, and you want him to treat the Jews better, but you won't accept them. He'll put them on luxury cruise liners. What's the problem? The consistent response was, we cannot be bothered. We're busy with a war right now. Right? And so the myth that, really is not relevant at all to the most serious historians' attempts to defend World War II, but is the dominant, frame of mind of people in the United States defending World War II, that it had something to do with rescuing the Jews, or, by the way, millions of non-Jews murdered in the camps. It has absolutely zero foundation in reality. There is no Uncle Sam wants you to save the Jews posters. Until after the war, until long after the war, it became this cause for after-the-fact justification of the war. I mean, in fact, really during the Vietnam War, that you had a bad war, so you had a good war, the World War II really became a good war with this ahistorical justification. I got 20 more of these, but somebody or two or three people wanted to say something.
Well, I did. I guess the first thing I would say is I wouldn't want to defend World War II on moral grounds. I would defend it on survival grounds, number one. And number two, despite all the difficulties with the Jews that you just listed, which are all true, Eisenhower did actually film the camps and everything, and made sure that it was recorded so that people would actually believe that it did happen. I mean, there were things moving in the right direction as a result of that horror. I wouldn't defend any war on right and wrong. It's just, are you willing to roll over and die or not? I'm not.
I would kind of think allowing millions of people to die would be wrong, so I'm not clear on the distinction.
I want to know about the role of corporations in World War II. So I understand we had money on both sides, that Brown, Harriman, and whatever, the Bush family was funding money on both sides. We had industries that were supplying machinery to the Germans, even though they were supposed to have stopped. There was also a lot of the countries that were, aggressive, were also protecting oil and oil routes. And so when I hear World War II, I'm going like, I have no clear concept. I would never be for it or justify it in any way, but I don't think there's any truth of I'm interested in the myths about World War II, because there's so much that narrative that we have been sold through our crappy education system that I could never say that could be justified, because just the facts. We don't get the facts.
So when I start to talk about influences on the Nazis' evil plans by others, including the United States, we have to sort of issue the caveat that this does not somehow bizarrely remove the guilt of the Nazis for their crimes, right? So, you know,
I'm
the
not
fact
doing
that, no, you're not. I'm saying before I say what I'm about to say, I have to clarify, you know, because when you say that Roosevelt knew the Japanese were about to attack, that doesn't mean the Japanese were right to attack somehow. I mean, it's just crazy. So the Nazis for years openly studied and learned a great deal from Jim Crow laws, from U.S. racist policy. The Nazis for many years, and Hitler in particular, learned a great deal about eugenics and racist policies from U.S. authors. U.S. corporations funded the Nazi military buildup, in many cases, right through the course of the war, in violation of U.S. laws by that point. But through the 20s and 30s and 40s, and immediately after the war and subsequently, although the major evil demon of U.S. popular culture ever since World War II has been Adolf Hitler, the major enemy of the U.S. government was and continued to be the Soviet Union. And so the idea of funding the German government through the 20s and 30s and right up to World War II was a preferable alternative to funding the evil communists in the Soviet Union. This was the view of the US and British and other governments. In fact, within hours of the German surrender at the end of World War II, Winston Churchill proposed a new war on the Soviet Union using German troops, among others. So you have to understand that the top priority was the communist threat. Not just during the Cold War, but for decades prior, in the view of the U.S. government. And so the fact that U.S. corporations and banks and Wall Street were funding the Nazis does not excuse the Nazis' crimes, but it does suggest that there was a problem. The fact that U.S. government doctors were continuing human experimentation and eugenics and so forth for decades after World War II and treating the Nuremberg Code as a good code for barbarians, this was the phrase often used, you know, doesn't excuse those crimes when they were committed by the Germans, but it does suggest a certain double standard and a certain lack of the pure good versus evil combat that you see depicted in Hollywood movies about World War II.